next question is directed towards the Commissioner, and it comes from Dave Jane. How does India fit in with current sustainability initiatives in the state of Minnesota, and how do U.S. firms participate?
If the question was about sustainability initiatives in Minnesota and how can companies participate in that, we can have discussions about sustainability, but we usually talk about them in terms of issues like energy independence, the adoption of alternative sources of electricity and mobile fuels, alternative fuels, and the reduction of energy use through techniques like conservation and improved control systems, the so-called green cluster of industries. Minnesota has taken something of a lead on that, but we are challenged by the fact that we have been excessively dependent on coal and natural gas for electricity. We get a relatively small percentage of nuclear power, and we buy hydropower from Manitoba. But in a very bipartisan effort, in 2007, we passed the most ambitious renewable portfolio standard for electricity in the country, committing to get 25% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2025, but mandating that utilities with nuclear capacity get 30% by 2020, and about half our power is sold by nuclear utilities. So we have a very ambitious standard. At the same time, committed to a 1.5% per year reduction in demand through a conservation mandate on utilities starting this year. It actually rolls in 2011, starts in 2010, and also committing to a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. And left, the mandates there are on utilities, and we are already seeing utilities move into areas like wind power. We're fourth in the nation on a non-population adjusted basis in wind power, about 1,300 megawatts up. To meet this 2025-2030 requirement, we need about 6,000 megawatts. It probably can't all be wind, but we are also seeing some other renewable energy. We're seeing substantial interest in a variety of conservation techniques. You may have seen an announcement last week that a company called Sage Electrochromics has financed a 250,000 square foot facility in Baraboo to build glass that changes color in response to the sun. They're basically color adjustable sunglasses for buildings, which is, and they lead the nation in that. The president described Minnesota as the Silicon Valley of glass, which is a little funny when you know what glass is made of. But we also attracted last year about a $60 million investment by a Japanese company called Daikin Makoe to build a state-of-the-art energy conservation research facility, principally for air conditioning, but also for heating systems. And they chose Minneapolis, saying that it was the epicenter now of research in those conservation areas. They had intended to build the facility in Osaka, where all of their other research is done. How companies engage is often through the technology with partners, and many of the companies, particularly in wind and solar, are very small. Some of them have licensed university intellectual property. Others have had a variety of ideas that have spun out of Minnesota companies. The addendum to the question was, how do we connect that to India? And some of these companies are doing that. Some are still small. Companies like that I mentioned, Sage Electrochromics or 10K Solar or Solar Skies, are trying to develop some scale here before doing a lot internationally. But there's certainly, we, through the trade office and our business community development effort, try to connect companies that have common interests in different countries.
Thank you. Our next question is directed to Professor Rao and to Mr. Prabhakar, and it's from someone who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll find you later. Based, and by the way, that's not an option, put your name on your cards. Based on the trend in creating products for the developing countries and customizing for the developed markets, how do you balance consumer behavior and needs, which are significantly different between these two countries, meaning the US and India?
I I just spent 4 hours talking about this to an executive MBA class. I don't think I can answer that question in 5 minutes. But let me try.
Professor Rao, you only have 3 minutes.
I only have 3 minutes. That took 2 minutes right there, Shanaka. One of the differences we emphasized today was the differences in time perception across cultures, and you just saw a demonstration of that. Shanaka takes 30 seconds and makes it 2 minutes, just like that. The short answer to your question is to conduct market research to fully and clearly understand the underlying consumer motives that drive purchasing decisions. And I'll give you a really quick example. There are some cultures that are bicultural, case in point being India and Singapore. And it turns out that we ran a study and we primed the Chinese culture among Singaporeans by showing them a collage of Chinese images, and we primed the Western culture among Singaporeans by showing them a collage of Western images. And then we checked to make sure that we were indeed generating those mental models by asking them to name 3 politicians that came to mind, and the folks who had been primed with the Chinese culture mentioned Megawati Sukarnoputri, Lee Kuan Yew, etc. And the folks who've been primed with the Western culture mentioned George Bush and Colin Powell and so forth. We then asked them how much they would be willing to pay to have a book delivered to them in 3 days rather than the standard 1 week. And the folks who've been primed with the Western prime were willing to pay 28% more than the folks who've been primed with the Chinese prime. Remember, we're randomly drawing from the same population, so there is no difference between these people other than my experimental manipulation. So what does this mean? It means for a company like Starbucks, choosing to be culturally sensitive going into Singapore, they hire Singaporean employees and they operate on the premise that the concept of time there is different than the concept of time in the West, because they've observed Singaporeans going to the wet market and waiting 30 minutes for fish. But these people are bicultural. And so when they walk into a Starbucks, they're employing a Western mindset and they want their coffee now. And if they don't get it, they go down to the coffee shop down the street. So I guess the bottom line of the story I'm telling is you need to develop what I call consumer intimacy. You need to imagine yourself in the shoes of the consumer. You need to be, the 3 deadliest words in the English language are, and it's not I don't know, but the 3 most difficult words. The 3 deadliest words are, honey, what's wrong? Not only should you know what's wrong, you should have been able to figure out your role in generating that bad outcome. You should have fixed it. Now, if you as a brand are able to develop the kind of intimacy that anticipates consumer problems by virtue of your being embedded in their cultural context and solving it even before they realize that they have a problem, there is no amount of price cutting by a Walmart that can take that customer away from you.
Thank you. Very good response. And just adding a little bit to that, what we found is the only thing you can generalize about India is that you cannot generalize about India. Every individual is more unique than in any other country in the world. So it's very hard to even fix a buying pattern, like you said. But there is a tiered approach, and the business model seems to be the critical piece of, rather than the consumer buying patterns. In the business model that seemed to work, at least initially, is what we call here the cable business model. You start with a basic cable, and then you keep adding features for different tiers of the Indian consumer market. And then people can choose and tap into the different levels as appropriate, and that seems to work very well. Interestingly, I just heard a story that when the cable company, by the way, goes to India, they give the first one in the block buys the cable and pays for it, and then within 2 weeks, the rest of the block has got cable. and then the way they collect the money is actually a guy goes door to door and says, just give me whatever you can, because I know you're receiving the cable.